This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 191, Clergymen. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And holy cow, Burt, are you ready for this episode?
I'm very ready. I'm brightly scrubbed and ready to go.
All right. Well, bless yourself, then don't mess yourself, and here we go. The show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles191, all lowercase. That will take you to our website where you can do all kinds of things. You can click on links, you can leave us a comment, you can help support the show via PayPal or Patreon. Whatever your choice, just do something there and share the show with Sherlockians that you know and love. Help them discover this great way of talking about and thinking about Sherlock Holmes. Well, we said we would be talking about clergymen in the canon. You know, this is an interesting topic to me, Bert, because we'll get to the various mentions that are had throughout the canon, and they are various and varied and numerous. But if we step back a couple of decades, it's important to remember that Arthur Conan Doyle came from an Irish Catholic family. Certainly he was raised in Edinburgh, but his family was Irish in nature and were Catholics, and he was actually sent to a Jesuit school. I believe it was Stonyhurst, was it not?
Yes, indeed.
And there, as many children who are sent to stern Catholic schools, he developed a particular disdain for the religion that then, I think, colored much of the rest of his life, whether it was his writings, his speaking career. Of course, he later became an advocate of spiritualism much earlier than folks really imagined. By the time World War I rolled around, he was well into it. And when his son passed away, that is the belief system that he turned to for solace. But he was already well along the way to spiritualism then. And so it's of interest then that we see religion pop into the Sherlock Holmes stories between 1887 and 1927. Now, religion was something that was fairly common in or I would say more mainstream in Victorian times. I think it was expected that pretty much everyone had some religious belief system in the mainstream. So it would not have been strange for Sherlock Holmes or Dr. Watson to come across religious personages. And we see this probably as early on as, well, not probably, definitely as early on as A Study in Scarlet, if we want to go back to the beginning of the canon. A very different kind of religious scene there, and I would say non-typical religious leaders in that case. What are we talking about in A Study in Scarlet?
Well, in A Study in Scarlet, we're talking about the Mormon faith, and although we don't see many, well, we don't see any, I don't think, practicing, let's put it this way, pulpit type clergymen in action, really anywhere in the canon. But we're talking about in the Mormon faith, the small group of essentially elders who are behind some of the events that are reported in that case. Yeah,
and these are not necessarily the types of religious leaders that you would admire. They are the Mormon group, the Danites, which are the fraternal organization founded by the Latter-day Saint members. And interestingly enough, as it is referred to on the Wikipedia page for Danites, because we find in A Study in Scarlet a mention of the Holy Four, and it led me to wonder, well, who exactly are the Four anyway, and why did they get this kind of assignation? And it's of course a fictionalization of the Mormon faith at the time, and it's as described briefly by Wikipedia. The Danites constitute a brutal group of enforcing vigilantes operating under the direction of Brigham Young, and more particularly the fictional Sacred Council of Four, silencing criticism and questioning and preventing dissenters from leaving the Salt Lake Valley. So, that is religious extremism in its worst form. And I think Conan Doyle fictionalized it and dramatized it for appropriate effect. We don't run into any religious fanatics quite so evil and violent in any of the other stories, thank goodness.
No, not at all. And it's interesting that, one would think if you were simply presented with decades of cases of a consulting detective, that members of the clergy would feature more prominently from the standpoint of action. I mean, after all, the vicar in a small community is the source of solace, the source of instruction, the person who marries and buries people. And regular attendance at religious services brings the community together, brings people together. So you would think that those personalities would loom larger, but there's really only one case, which we'll eventually get to, I think, where the clergyman has a real, set of features and actions and is a real character. Many of the time we encounter clergymen in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, it's in an offhand manner that gets us to some other person or some other event. And of course, in memorable ways, Holmes himself will impersonate a clergyman from time to time.
Yes, he will. And that is no sooner than the very first short story, A Scandal in Bohemia, where he assumed the personage of a nonconformist clergyman. I guess this could be described in modern terms as perhaps a generic clergyman. I don't know, a nonconformist. Is that a particular religious set of beliefs? Because conformity to which branch of the religion?
Well, that is a very interesting question. I always sort of assumed it was sort of like a Unitarian, what we would think of today, but I don't know.
Well, I will do you the favor of going to, once again, our weapon of choice.
In English church history, a nonconformist was a Protestant who did not conform to
the Church of England. Yeah.
Well, but it's a little bit more. It was after the Restoration, and the issue there was the uniformity of practice throughout the kingdom and eliminating things that to some audiences would smack, as they would say at the time, of popery or this, that, and the other thing. And as a result, there were a large number of clergymen who were essentially ejected from the C of E at the time. But how that would devolve down to Victorian eras beyond.
Well, by the late 19th century, the term specifically included the Reformed Christians, which are Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and other Calvinist sects, plus the Baptists and the Methodists. So that's a pretty broad umbrella for nonconformists.
Oh, right. So a nonconformist is really anybody who's belongs to a non-Anglican church.
Right. So in that sense, it was Holmes as a generic clergyman, a non-Church of England clergyman. Could have been, as we say, Presbyterian, Calvinist, Methodist, etc.
Interesting.
Which, if you're going for disguise, I suppose that's probably the most intelligent one to assume, because if anyone asks you about particular church doctrines, as Irene Adler was wont to do, you'd have a safe haven because you'd have, 6 or so religions to choose from.
Yes. Say, Father, if you have a minute, can we talk a bit about Ecclesiastes?
Oh my goodness.
I've always been puzzled by this reference. Yeah.
Well, we have a little bit of doctrine to handle here, and that is through our sponsor, so stay with us. We say the Baker Street Journal is an irregular quarterly of Sherlockiana, but the fact is you can count on the Baker Street Journal to arrive in your mailbox if you're a regular subscriber 5 times a year. That's once a quarter, plus the Christmas annual. And each time it arrives, it has a regular array of features such as the editor's gas lamp, Art in the Blood, the Commonplace Book, Baker Street Inventory, and more. And of course, peppered throughout are insightful articles and scholarship that make the world of Sherlock Holmes come alive to people around the world as they try their hand at finding out deeper details about some of the minutiae in the stories or about Victorian life. If you don't yet, please consider a subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and make sure you get your regular delivery of the journal today. We're back talking about clergymen in the canon. And it's interesting because in that story where we just left off, in A Scandal in Bohemia, in addition to Holmes being the clergyman, there was another clergyman who was involved, and that was the I don't even know who it was. Was it a priest or a reverend?
Never identified.
Never identified at St. Monica's in the Edgware Road, where Irene Adler and Godfrey Norton were married. And of course, Sherlock Holmes was a witness. This is one of the few times where we witness a marriage taking place in the canon, because there were a couple of others that were would-be marriages, such as when Robert St. Simon was abandoned at the altar by Hattie Duran in The Noble Bachelor. And then, of course, the attempted forced marriage between Roaring Jack Woodley and Violet Smith in The Solitary Cyclist. And that was ostensibly performed by Reverend Williamson, who had been defrocked and had attained the marriage license by a trick. We talked about nefarious religious types in Study in Scarlet. Reverend Williamson probably rises to that, nearly to that level as well.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Well, there's another not so holy man, and interestingly enough, he went by the name of Holy Peters. What can you tell us about this personage from The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax?
Well, this is a great scoundrel, a great masquerader, a great person who uses the trappings of the clergy to build relationships and steal and take advantage and waylay unsuspecting people. And so he's a confidence trickster, basically.
How appropriate. Reverend Schlesinger. The Shropshire Slasher. Schlesinger. This is, particularly older women who didn't have family to rely on, didn't have other individuals off of whom to bounce certain decisions that they were making. And the holy Peters, Reverend Schlesinger, would catch them at their most vulnerable moments and take advantage of them. Pretty evil when you think about it. Well, on the flip side, if you want to talk about some of the most humble and contrite clergymen, there's one that almost escapes notice from the Hound of the Baskervilles that you and I were talking about before we started the show. Why don't you share that with our listeners?
Oh yeah, this is a really lovely thing because it's something that certainly escaped my notice. There's a spot in The Hound of the Baskervilles where Watson is inquiring about who, I believe of Dr. Mortimer, who would inherit the estate. I think it's Watson, could be Holmes, but in any case, the discussion is who could inherit all this. And we're told that the descendants of the Baskervilles, the line is sort of petered out, but that there was a relative in the clergy named James Desmond, a man of venerable appearance and saintly life. And Sir Charles apparently wished to provide some sort of settlement to James Desmond, which he staunchly refused and wouldn't have anything to do with it. So he's apparently taken himself out of the running for any inheritance associated with the Baskervilles. Wow.
How kind. How kind. That's, maybe he just wasn't a dog person. That could be. That could be. Well, we promised you one clergyman who figures prominently. And Bert, I'm going to let you take the reins on this one because you know this story better than I do since it is part of your home scion of the Cornish horrors.
Oh yeah, well it's the vicar Roundhay in the Cornish horrors, and he's a wonderful character for a variety of reasons, but unique among the clergymen in the canon. Roundhay actually kicks off activity. He is the one who basically in this Cornish village where Holmes and Watson have gone for recuperation and study. He's the vicar of Tredannick Wallace in Cornwall. And it's in his vicarage where Mortimer Tregennis, the brother of the victims of the Cornish horror, lodged. So the brother of the poor people who are found dead in the story is actually lodging with Roundhay, but it's Roundhay too who goes to Holmes and insists on his investigating. And he's a bachelor, he's an archaeologist, and we know from Watson that he's a middle-aged man, he's portly, he's affable, with a considerable fund of local lore. So he's a mover and a shaker. He kicks things off, he observes events, he comments and has several interactions with Holmes and Watson. He is, of all of the vicars, and many of them in the stories, as we heard from James Desmond and others, are just people who happen in passing. But Roundhay is a real personality in the village of Tredannick Wallace.
And do we know what branch of the Christian religion he represents?
Well, because he's vicar, and it's such a small town, I would think it would be C of E.
C of E. And not a shaker, as you say.
A mover, but not a shaker. Yeah.
There you go. And certainly not a Quaker. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
I have been ordained.
And unfrocked.
Once a clergyman, always a clergyman.
I think not.